have Josh Cameron, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at Workforce.com. And then we also have Rick Bell, who is our editorial-in-chief at Workforce Magazine. And they are going to go ahead and talk about the new Biden Union Task Force and see what it means for businesses today.
Well, Lynn is very kind, isn't she?
Oh, my hair looks great. Thank you. I wake up extra early on webinar
She's
day.
talking about me.
Oh, thank you.
No, I'm sure she wasn't.
Okay. Well, great. But I'm going to hand off over to Josh and Rick.
All right.
Thanks, everyone. So I think to kick us off, Rick's going to tell us a bit more about what's been happening at Amazon, sort of.
Yeah, so that was back in April. Of course, this was an issue that had been going on for a while about the unionization push for the Amazon warehouse. I believe it was in Bessemer, Alabama. And ultimately, the contention was employees were dissatisfied with productivity pressures, health issues surrounding the pandemic and coronavirus, and wages as well. Ultimately, Amazon had numerous lunch and learns and speaking sessions, and the union did as well in their push. Ultimately, the unionization push was shot down by basically a 2-to-1 margin. It was essentially 1,800 against to 738 for. So yeah, basically it came out 2-to-1. And ironically, maybe not ironically, Amazon is now talking about opening up a new warehouse somewhere else in Alabama as well. So what can you take away from that particular unionization push? Well, I don't know that that's just one that says unionization is dead, because you also had a hospital group, I believe, in North Carolina that approved unionization among its nurses, and that was approved. So it's like there are conflicting issues here, and so. Is it dead? No. Is it thriving? No. But I think under Biden's PRO Act, the Protecting the Rights to Organize Act, we are going to see a much stronger push into unionization. And I think, Josh, this is pretty much the reason we are having this particular discussion right now today.
Yeah. Well, basically, I think the rules around unionization and forming the union are going to change, and it's going to sort of make it easier to form unions and for workforces to become unionized. So that's basically what we want to talk about today. We're going to go quickly through sort of some of the things that we've picked up that are happening and then coming out of the Biden administration, and then we're going to sort of look at how this is played out in other economies. We obviously have a lot of experience in Australia, so we know how the unionization movement works there. And some of these things that are being proposed are pretty similar to what we see in Australia. And then at the end, we're just going to sort of talk about, hey, what can you do to get in front of this? What can you do to make it less attractive for employees to choose to unionize? And that's probably the bit I want to spend the most time on, and that's where we'd love to get more feedback as we go through. So let's kick it off. So I'm not going to read these slides out, but basically what we're getting at here is this National Labor Relations Act is quite old. It's been the foundations for a long time, and Biden has set up a high priority task force to start looking at the things that are in here. Sorry, I just need to mute some notifications. And he's going to, he's got Kamala Harris on it. He's got the Secretary of Labor Defense. This is a big swing committee. So we think this is going to definitely have an impact, and they're definitely prioritizing this as part of what they're trying to do. As Rick was saying, we've seen a decline in union membership. This has been happening worldwide, but in 2020, I did notice this graph ends. There was actually a rise for the first time in a long time. So whether it was the pandemic, whether it was just the Biden administration starting to change some of these things, making it easier. We've seen for the first time in basically like 25, 30 years that there's been any increase. So
yeah, and really, Josh, like the graph shows or like the chart shows, we've seen a huge drop in unionization since the 1980s. I mean, I believe the figure is for private industry, 6% of the workforce is unionized. Now, when you factor in government employees, that number rises, and that may be a part of it as well. So yeah, so it is definitely on the decline.
Yeah, cool. So that's probably stuff everyone knew. So what's the scope of this task force? What are they doing? It really has been set up with a mandate to help unions, to be a pro-union task force. The aim is to try and increase union membership across the US and remove barriers that sort of make it harder for people to join a union. Apparently, this report is going to be released in the next 6 months. So there's a few months now to where they're going to be looking at this and deciding what they're going to do. Will this make any difference? Well, here's some research we found from 2018, which said that 48% of non-unionized workers would join a union if they were given the opportunity. So there's probably not surprisingly, there's around 50% of people who would join a union if it was easy, if it was there. And I think that's what we have. I think that's what this is going to be. This task force is going to be working on. It's like, okay, how do we get those people so they can just tick a box, or it's just part of their employment, or it's just an easy thing for them to do. And I think that's going to be what the whole aim of this project is for them. We've got a poll running at the moment. It's not super relevant to here, but we're going to come back to it at the end, and we're interested to see how people are sort of taking feedback from employees at the moment. The strongest predictor whether someone will join is whether they believe they have a voice or not. So this is why we're kind of interested in what voice do you give your employees at the moment, and do employees feel like they're heard if they have issues, and do they feel like management actually does anything about them? So that's sort of something worth touching on here with this poll, and it seems like we've about 50-50 people not having a particular structure for it or not collecting any, and a lot of people saying they collect feedback annually. The initial work we've done around this sort of says that annually is really way too long, that it's much better to we actually try and do this on a shift basis. So at the end of each shift, you're giving opportunities to employees to give their feedback right there and then. And that's good. You don't have to look at it every day, but you're collecting it every day. You can sort of see the themes that are coming up. And instead of it just being like, oh, we check the suggestion box once a year, that doesn't inspire employees to think that management listens to what they say. But if you're collecting their feedback all the time, and once a month you're going in back and saying how you've looked at that and the common themes in it and what you're doing about them, then it can be really productive. And we've done quite a bit of analysis on the type of feedback that people give, and it's surprisingly like 50% of it is kind of positive. It's not just all people complaining about things. It's people with actual like suggestions that are helpful. It's people saying that this shift went really well. This was like a good team. I like my manager, things like that. So I think there is a lot of value to be had there, and a lot of potential improvement to come from speeding up the cycle that feedback comes through. Here we back onto like the changes that this committee is going to make. There's some ideas about removing the distinctions between employees and supervisors. So that has impact on overtime hours, as you know. It also has impact on tipping. So that's something they're looking at. A big one is this idea that maybe contractors could be included in the bargaining units. I think why that's highly relevant is a lot of what management relies on if there is a strike or something is bringing in the contractors to like keep the factory running or keep the nursing home open. So if they're also being included as part of the bargaining unit, then that's going to give the union a lot more power in these negotiations. So I think that's why they're looking at that one. This third one is one we find particularly interesting because this is basically what we have in Australia at the moment, which is removing the idea that the sort of each union belongs to to a single employer. And there's a lot of what we see in Australia is sort of, we call it demarcation, but it's a way for a single union to sort of monopolize all workers in a particular industry. And they sort of, they work across, and they really like use that to generate more power because it's an industry-wide thing. So we think changes around how unions are organized and how they're allowed to organize could have a very big impact in how effective they can be. And yeah, easier worker access to voting and bargaining. I think that's sort of coming out of some of that Amazon stuff, and how people were actually voting in these ballots and who had the information and how they're run, and basically if they're run fairly. Cool. Yeah, what's the impact of this going to be? I think we do kind of know this, because it's not like there's not union agreements at the moment. There's collective bargaining agreements all across the US, and we sort of see the type of things that are in them all the time, and they're very often about minimum wages and having a lot of union agreements are about loyalty and how long an employee has been. So seniority becomes very important. There's often things that are saying that as you stay at the company longer, you need to get paid more each year, that you need to be given preference over certain things. There's very often rules about changing schedules and changing hours and things like that. And what can come with it is sort of, it kind of it reduces flexibility for employers, because these are things that they're sort of committed to over a long period. So it can give some certainty, but it also can make it harder to change things and harder to do things. So that's a bit of a summary of it. Some of the impacts that might be coming. On the back of that, we can talk a bit more about what we do see in Australia, which is a much stronger collective bargaining economy. So very often the union and the employer are coming to an agreement about their wages, and this also happens at an industry-wide level. And some of the big things we see is just that it can get very complex to work out some of these things. So there's the alternative rates, like the shift differentials get very complicated. The overtime gets very complicated. It becomes quite a burden on the employer to work these things out. But also just much larger penalties for underpaying staff for getting that wrong. A lot less flexibility around scheduling, around notice, a lot more commitments to the number of hours that an employee will get, a lot more commitment to their exact schedule that they'll work. There's really a very long list. This just kind of touches on it, the sort of things that we see in collective bargaining agreements. Don't know if anyone had any other comments on that, Rick.
Well, I think some of the things that employers should be looking at is what industries or what employees, what workers are going to have potential for unionization. And I think one is, so are your wages tied to minimum wage? Are your employees hourly? A couple of the industries, interestingly, that have potential for unionization. One is the cannabis industry, because so many of those employees are hourly, and they're working in basically manual type positions. Mm-hmm. You also have gig workers, and I think you touched on that a little bit with the contractors. Now, independent there's this whole battle about independent contractors, mm-hmm. and should they be considered employees? You're going to see that's going to be a big shift over the course of the next several years under the Biden administration, the classification of employees. So I think your gig workers, whether they're in rideshare or like Instacart or in one of those kinds of industries or positions, you're going to see potential for unionization or classification of those employees.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I see we've just chucked the poll up there about whether you pay alternative rates or pay differentials for workers. I think what we mean by this is basically it's the Friday night shift. No one wants to work on Friday night. So if you work your shift between like 6 p.m. and 5 a.m., you might get paid an extra 30%, or you might get paid an extra $1. We actually do see a lot of this in the US. And it's what's nice about the shift differentials we do see is they're kind of negotiated sort of between the employer and the employee according to what's needed at the time and what kind of makes sense and how to make it fair. What we see a lot more of in Australia is that these are kind of set permanently and like they're part of the, it's not really in response to how bad the shift really is. It's kind of just, oh, this is what it's always been. So I think in general, shift differentials aren't necessarily a bad thing for employers. It's like, these are probably hard to fill shifts anyway. It's a way of like sort of rewarding employees who are taking shifts that are undesirable. I think what the concern is when this is sort of locked in and permanently set. So that's why we like to ask this question. I'm interested to see where people are at. It does seem like there's quite a few people who are already using shift differentials as part of their sort of benefits package.
So let me ask you on that, Josh. Is that something that I'm guessing employers decide to use that as an incentive on their own, and what would really prompt the employer to want to do that? I mean, because like you're saying, you're going to be paying an extra $1 an hour. Shouldn't that be, if I'm asking you, the job candidate, to work a Friday night shift or work a Saturday night shift, shouldn't that be part of the hiring process? I am hiring you for this specific role, and you can accept it or not. So I guess what we're saying is that incentivizing employees to work these shifts comes down to money. And
yeah, I think it comes down to the market force as well, which I think last month's webinar was all about how to get people to sort of work some of these shifts. And one of the big things is these alternate rates. And there's definitely, like, I think there's two parts to it. One is just an element of fairness. So like, if the whole employee group knows that like these shifts are undesirable, then some fair way of getting people to work those makes sense. And like, you can, in like a manufacturing sense, you might do like a rotating schedule where it's like everyone works every second weekend, or everyone works like one weekend every month. But where that's not as practical, I think the shift differentials are a way to sort of reward employees that are working those shifts without having to penalize people. And it's probably going to make it overall much easier to recruit a good base of employees. So that's why I think people have it. I think it's not necessarily a bad thing. And I think that's why we're seeing that it is quite common and quite popular already. And it's definitely one of the suggestions that we think people should think about and consider. Where on the administrative front and on the systems front, it can get very difficult to do this. So it is good.
Well, I was going to chime in. I actually think it's almost an expectation for someone who's getting hired for an overnight shift that they're going to get paid more than the first and second shifts. If they're doing overnight, they're expecting to get paid more. So if your company doesn't, if it's a warehouse setting and you don't give that shift difference, then it's going to be so much harder for you guys to get someone on board to work overnight, because at this point it's become somewhat of an expectation from what I've seen.
Yeah.
So Josh, do you see that question there? From S.
Yeah,
I think that's an interesting question. Yes, from the 1980s till today, we have seen this boom in technology. I mean, it's shifted, and I think the workforce has itself shifted dramatically from, if we want to use blue collar to white collar. We've seen the shift from a more manufacturing based economy to a more knowledge based economy, if that's the correct terminology. And so, yeah, technology has played a huge role, and it's not just the automation of a manufacturing plant, although that probably factors into it. But I think it's just the shift as well from working on the floor of a manufacturing plant to working in an office in downtown Chicago.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good response. I try not to get too economics in these webinars, but the economic explanation.
Go for it.
The economic explanation is
good.
that technology is making people more productive, and that's increasing. So like we've got all these machines, we've got these computers now, so the whole workforce is getting productive, and that's increasing the pie. It's increasing the amount of money that both companies and employees are bringing home. And I think when people are well paid, that it brings less. It's like when people feel like their earnings are growing and they're getting well rewarded for their work, then it's going to be less likely that they unionize. In terms of technology more directly, I'd like to think that systems that are adding flexibility and transparency, and like I'd like to think systems like what we build are reducing the need for unions, because it's reducing the friction between employers and employees, making it more transparent and making it fairer and making it easier to be fair. But I'm probably a little bit biased on that one.
Well, all right. So let me ask you this real quick. I know there's some other questions lined up here, but let me ask you this real quick, because I did hear an expert talking about unionization in the tech sector. And if you were to see unionization in the tech sector, and I know that's really broad, but where would you guess that would happen? Would it be people who are programming? I mean, where would you see who would be unionizing and where?
Yeah, I think it would be pretty interesting to get a unionization of people who are paid like an average of $220,000 a year or something. Like, I don't think it's an obvious place to start. And I don't think it's super likely to get many legs. I think you're going to see more of that, where maybe ops people in software companies would have more reason to do that, because every software company needs them to keep the site up and keep it running, so they might have more leverage. But I think these people are more likely just to negotiate higher salaries for themselves, and that's what we have seen. Like in the tech industry, wages have been increasing far beyond what everyone else has been seeing. So I don't think we're going to see it.
So there are really very few positions that are tied to, say, minimum wage or tied to an hourly position.
Yeah, like Tracy said, they're like help desk people probably be the most likely to see that type of thing. I think Leslie's comment on shift differentials is spot on. Like healthcare, we see heaps and heaps of that, and we see incentives. And again, healthcare, we also see a lot of unionization, particularly in some states. It's really the norm. So yeah, it's a response to the market forces there, isn't it? And I think that's what Leslie's hitting on there.
And also, off of Leslie's comment, I have a friend who's a nurse, and with COVID, they were getting paid more per shift if they were on the COVID floor, and if their percentage of patients were there for COVID, they would get, I think, 30% added on to their hourly rate. So that's something new that came up. But yeah, the hazard pay. Exactly.
Cool.
Yeah.
So just to wrap things up, we kind of just want to, like Rick and I were talking about this before, and it's kind of like how to actually respond to this, how to prepare for this. And a lot of what we're getting at here is basically, how can you just be a good employer? How can you build trust with your workforce, so that if it does come to being a vote on it, or if there does come to being a push for unionization, you sort of you put some money in the bank before with these employers, and you've got some trust there to base this off. And this is probably, you can probably assess for yourself whether your industry, like how much work to put into this based on your industry and based on the likelihood of this happening. But they're also just in general good things to do. Like we're in this super competitive labor market at the moment where it's really hard to hire people. Like being a good employer, I don't think a lot of these things aren't particularly hard. And we'll run through them quickly, but transparency over pay, conditions, and business environment, like making sure staff understand how they're paid, why they're paid, that it's accurate. They can see their timesheet, they can see the shift differentials or whatever, or overtime that they're paid. They're confident that these things are getting calculated correctly and that they're getting what they're entitled to. Being transparent about the business environment. Hey, we're having a tough time at the moment. It's a good time. Like making sure you're communicating with them regularly about that. I wanted Meg to chime in about this next one about,
And I was going to jump in, transparency over pay. Like from an HR perspective, being an HR manager, the worst thing you can do is ever mess up someone's paycheck, because essentially that's why people work, is to get paid. So just making sure your system or whatever you're using is very seamless and correct is really important. And also teaching the team members how to access it so they can see everything on their end is good too. But then fairness and performance management, pretty much, I mean, my least favorite part about HR is definitely if you have to let someone go, but it's a little bit better as long as they know what's coming. Like if you're letting someone go and they are completely blindsided, that means something went wrong on the business end of things. Like we need to make sure that we're checking in with employees and we're giving them a fair chance if they are not performing, giving them different thresholds, different metrics to hit just to make sure that everything's fair for them. And at the end of the day, if it doesn't work out and they're not able to perform, that happens, but it just shouldn't be a shock. So a lot of documentation and just making everything really transparent is important.
Yeah. We already spoke about this, so we did the poll about it, and I already sort of gave some comments about employee feedback and reducing the cycle with which you get that, and trying to collect that all the time and review it and report back on what you're doing about it much more often. Really can help employees feel engaged and feel sort of like they're cared about. Increasing flexibility for employees. So this is a good one, and I think it's not as hard as it seems, but this is the things like allowing employees to select when they might not be available for shifts so that they can fit the rest of their life around their work. It's things like allowing employees to swap their shifts. So these are things that can be done these days using technology to not cause a huge burden on managers to manage it all. It can sort of happen between employees themselves or with the right level of oversight, so it's not a big administrative burden, and it can really make a big difference to the enjoyment the employee can have out of their job because they're able to fit the rest of their life around it, particularly with millennials. Yeah.
I think one other point on that, Josh, is building in hybrid workplaces. So as we see more and more people returning to the workplace, there's this push for hybrid work. Can they work remotely? How often can they work remotely? Do they have to be in the office from 9 to 5, 5 days a week? Is that the requirement now? So we're seeing this already with discussions around hybrid workplaces.
Yeah, I've been getting a lot of questions just because right now I have a lot of roles I'm hiring for, and a lot of people are asking about what our situation is and what it's going to be 6 months from now. So it's important to also be transparent about that, just Absolutely. So they know what they're signing up for.
Yes.
Cool. We only got a couple minutes left, so I'm going to quickly go through these. Consider differentials for shifts that are hard to fill or unpleasant. I think we already spoke about that a lot, so we don't think we need to go over that. And this last one, showing appreciation. Like, I think if you take a long-term view as an employer and you realize that there is always a risk of unionization or things like this happening, then the cost of showing more appreciation to your employees is actually very, very low. Like this is such an easy thing to do, but it goes so far. And we're really talking about people's, like, how they feel about the company, how they feel about you, and for leadership to be making sure that it's clear that people are appreciated and are, like, their work is important. And I think it's really valuable. Meg, a few ideas on actual practical ways of doing that.
Yeah, I honestly think this is the best part of being in HR because it does feel good to show appreciation to your employees, but it's just the general things like celebrating. You can celebrate birthdays, but I actually like to celebrate work anniversaries more. Just, having different merchandise available, groceries in the office, doing holiday parties, really anything that you can think of to get your team together. And it's also really beneficial to get them together where they're a little bit outside of a work setting, so they get to know each other on more of a personal level and not just their job titles. I think that also really helps build the team.
With community.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And awesome.
One last thing I wanted to show everyone, just because we literally, and it's really relevant to this transparency over pay conditions and environment and building this trust, is a new feature. We literally shipped this overnight, so I put this slide in at the end. But when employees they're seeing their shifts for the week, they're seeing what times they've clocked in and out. And instead of just being like, oh, okay, that's what you clocked in and out, that's what you get paid, we're now asking them to say, okay, yeah, that is what I worked, and all my hours are correct, my breaks are correct, all my PTO is accounted for, and like that is the rates I was meant to get paid for that, and getting them to confirm that. So it's really about increasing this, how we make sure employees really feel confident that they're getting paid correctly, and that they're getting a chance to, if there is a mistake, they get a chance to request a change, and they can they have visibility over how their rate is calculated and why that makes sense. So I just want to chuck that in there at the end. Is there any other questions or anything? We're a couple of minutes over, but I like Leslie's suggestion about surprise ice cream social. Sounds good to me.
It's a whole nother topic and it's a whole nother discussion, but how do you do that for a remote workforce? So, or a hybrid workforce. Anyway, again, that's a whole nother discussion.
Cool. Okay.
Right.
So ship me some pizza, please. Coupon vouchers.
Coupon vouchers.
Cool.
That's true. Also, a lot of different like DoorDash, Uber Eats, they've been rolling out these programs to send over coupons to your remote workforce, especially for any sort of meetings that you're having. And also just making sure you keep them included. Like I know I sent Rick a swag box since he is our Portland headquarters.
Yes.
So just keeping everyone included, and I think that's important as well. But pretty much, I think we are out of time if there aren't any more questions. But yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone for hopping on today. I think it was a really good conversation, and we really appreciate your participation. So just let us know if you have any other questions after the fact, but we are always coming out with new and relevant content, so keep an eye out for future workforce webinars. And yeah, I think that wraps it up. So thank you once again, and I hope everyone has a great day.